Hello everybody, welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. This is Alan and today is video number 3 in the beginners video series. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about lenses. I've said this before and I'll probably say it again before this series of videos is finished, but macro is different. It is different in many fundamental ways, but one of the most important differences comes down to the equipment. Camera lenses, when you think about it, all of them are made to take pictures of things that are bigger than your sensor. That makes sense, right? Do you know how big the sensor in your camera is? I'm assuming that you probably have either a micro four thirds camera or an APS-C camera if you're just getting started. If you have an APS-C camera, that's the size of your sensor. Not very big. 24 millimeters across, about 16 millimeters high. That's it. That's what sits inside your camera and records the pictures. If you have a full frame camera, your sensor is only that big. Notice that that's quite a bit smaller than the screen. This is important to know, and I'll explain why in a second. So this is what you're recording your pictures on, or more likely this. Or if it's micro four thirds, it's half of this. That would be the size of your micro four thirds sensor. If you're using a phone, it's half of that again. So the actual light sensing part of your camera is pretty small. And most of what you're photographing, people, animals, mountains, are big compared to that, right? This is not rocket science. It gets a bit harder, but so if you think about it in photography, you are trying to collect an image of, say, the Titanic and put it on a piece of sensor that size. That's an APS-C sensor. Not really, it's a dummy. I made it myself. It's the right size. I cut it out to size 24 by 16 millimeters. So that's an APS-C sensor. Which is bigger, this or the Titanic? Right, the Titanic is bigger. So how can you get a picture of the Titanic on this? Well, you need a lens that is going to reduce the size of the Titanic and present the sensor on your camera with a little Titanic. And all of our lenses do that. Whether you have a lens like this, which is a kit lens from some camera or other, 18 millimeters to 140 millimeters. Okay, so that's like a medium range telephoto lens on one end and a wide angle lens on the other. Some of your lenses will be fixed focal lengths. But they all have the same thing in common. They have a reproduction ratio that is relatively small. Like a 50 millimeter or a 35 millimeter lens like this is for a mirrorless camera. This little thing has a reproduction ratio of about 0.14. That means the image on your sensor is 0.14 times the size of the thing you're photographing. Make sense? So something that in the real world is, say, an inch tall, like a tree across the garden, may only be an inch tall if it was a big garden, I guess. But it would only be 1/10 of an inch on your sensor. And that's the key. That's the point. So whether your lens has a long focal length, like a super telephoto, 400, 500 millimeters, or it's a very wide angle lens, a 10 millimeter lens, say, which has an enormous range of view, they all have the same thing in common. They are reducing the size of what you're photographing so that it'll fit on the sensor. That is completely the opposite of what you're getting into, which is macro photography. In macro photography, we are trying to either reproduce at the same size what we see in nature on our sensor. In other words, a bug that would fit inside this rectangle would be appropriate for using with a macro lens, because the macro lens has a reproduction ratio of 1:1, not 1 to 0.1, but 1:1, meaning same size thing that you photograph is going to appear as the same size on the sensor, 1:1. Now, there are a lot of things that are called macro lenses that, or macro cameras even, macro settings on little cameras that are kind of stretching the meaning of the word, and maybe what they are offering you is 1:2 or 1:3 or even 1:4. It's still a lot closer up than your regular lens is going to be able to do, and that's important to remember. So when don't sneer at cameras that offer a macro setting that actually gives you a reproduction ratio of about 1:4. That's great for doing close-up work. That means, of course, that whatever you're photographing needs to be 4 times bigger than the sensor if you're photographing it at the closest focusing distance. But we'll talk about that in a bit. So this is an introductory series of videos. This is not going to teach you how to use any of these lenses. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through all of the different ways that we can accomplish the same thing. That is, have a lens that allows us to photograph either near or sometimes beyond that magic number of 1:1. Okay, so there are many, many different ways that you can focus an image onto your sensor at 1:1 using lenses that aren't made for it, for example. And I'll explain to you how that works. And what I'm going to do for each of these categories is explain to you why they are good and why they are not good, and specifically why they're good or not good for a beginner. And that's going to be important, because at the end of the day, what you want to know is, what's a good lens for me to start if I'm going to do macro, right? That's why you're watching this. Or you've already bought one and you want me to mention it so that you feel vindicated. In the interest of saving you time, I am going to tell you what the answer to this question is. And then I will go through explaining how I arrived at it. But if you are new to macro photography, and let's say you're not brand new to photography, you've been doing a little bit, you've done a bit of close-up stuff, but you're absolutely fascinated with small insects, and you really, really want to get good at photographing them, you're one kind of person. And for you, I would recommend that you buy a proper macro lens. There are a lot of solutions that you've heard about, I'm sure: extension tubes, reversed lenses, stacked lenses. All of these things will give you a macro lens, but they'll do it at a cost. So it's important that we draw a line of distinction between what we can do and what makes sense to do. For example, one of the things you'll hear many people talk about is, when you're starting out, use extension tubes. Don't buy a macro lens. Do extension tubes because it's cheaper. Well, it is cheaper. They're very inexpensive. You can buy a great set of extension tubes to put a 50mm lens on for $10. Just the tubes. If you want the connections because you're too lazy to reach forward and change the aperture with your fingers, then it'll maybe be $100 for the best set you can buy. But it's hard to use. When you use extension tubes, your 50mm lens on extension can no longer focus at infinity, and you get a fraction of the light you're used to seeing. So they're difficult to use. They're difficult to frame your shot. You're not able to access the usual things that you access for automatic focus and things like that. So you're doing it all by hand. You need to be doing it all by hand anyway. Macro is a manual type thing. So if you're not there yet, so you're interested in macro, you think, but you've never actually taken a close-up picture of any kind, I probably wouldn't buy a real macro lens. It's probably a bit early. I would wait until you know that this is something you're going to do at least some of the time. If you just want to taste it, then I still wouldn't go with extension tubes because they're too difficult to get a good picture with. What I would do instead would be go with something like a diopter, a close-up lens. This is a filter that goes on the front of your camera, and all it does is a magnifying glass. It makes the thing that you're looking at bigger so that the camera thinks it's closer. And that's what this is all about. Macro photography is about increasing the distance between your sensor and your lens, or decreasing the distance between your lens and your subject. And you can do either one. It's the ratio that counts. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So I'm going to guess that you have an APS-C camera. I'm guessing that's probably the most common thing. And these days, it's probably a mirrorless one. Am I right? Let's have a show of hands. I was wrong. So there you have the bottom line of what I'm going to say in the rest of this video. And that is, if you know that you're going to be at least halfway serious about this, get a macro lens. There is no better way to learn macro. There are a lot of different kinds of macro lenses, and I want to break that down as well so that we can be absolutely clear what I'm talking about, because not all macro lenses are the same. But we'll do that at the end because there's some nuance there. Let's run through the other things that you might want to consider. Now, this is mostly for the people who have not made up their mind that they're ready to sell their soul to the devil to do macro photography. They're just dipping a toe in the water. For you folks, your best bet, if you just want to take close-up pictures and see what they look like, buy a cell phone magnifying device. Now, you can spend gobs of money on this system from Moment, which is, okay, they're not my Moment lenses. That I borrowed them to give them a try. They're okay. They're not great. They're just okay. They're clip-on lenses for your phone. But in order to use them, you have to buy a case that is made for your phone. So you spend $100 on the lens and you have to spend the same amount for a case. Last year, I tested one of these clip-on doodads from APSC, which is a really inexpensive. I think that they were $20 at the time. I don't know what they are now, maybe a bit more. After giving it such a good review, it might have gone up in price. These things are a lot of fun. I had so much fun, and I didn't even know how to stop the thing from switching cameras on me, which it did all the time. I learned how to do that now, and frankly, I would rather use this than this, having tested them both. I'm going to be doing a video on these two. But get one of these and try it. Get one of these and go to the botanical gardens. And if you can't take a good picture on your cell phone with one of those, then don't bother buying an expensive macro lens. Seriously, it would be silly. But you've already got a camera. You take pictures, right? And you like to take pictures of things in nature, but you just wish you could be a bit closer. Buy a diopter. A diopter is a filter that goes on your filter ring on your camera. They make them in a couple of different sizes. I recommend these ones, the Nisi ones. I reviewed them last year. They're really good. They're very versatile, very nice, high quality glass. They claim to be apochromatic, but they're not, I don't think. For one thing, they only have 2 lens elements, so it's kind of impossible to be apochromatic. That's more information than you need, I'm sure. This is just a magnifying glass. See, that was proving it. This screws onto the front of your, well, that's not a good example because that's a macro lens. This screws onto the front of a lens. Now, they make them in different strengths. This one is 4.8 or thereabouts, 5 diopters. This is powerful. This is a powerful one that you would put on a lens like this, which is, what is this? 18 to 55. Oh, it's the wrong size, but they come with adapters. So That's all you do. You'd screw it on the end of the lens. And the beauty of this is it doesn't reduce the amount of light that gets to the sensor through the lens, which is a big problem with extension tubes. So it gives you a bright picture, and your autofocus and other features of the camera work great with this on. All this does is trick the lens into thinking that alligator is closer than it actually is. That's all. It's a magnifying glass. When you start using them on bigger, longer lenses, you need to use a lower diopter. That's because of the way the magnification works. Now, one problem with these is, this is the big one that I would put on a big lens like that. This will give you a 1-to-1 magnification on this lens. This is a 70-200 lens. Now, bear in mind that the reproduction ratio on this is like 0.1. I should have turned that off, shouldn't I? So another option, if you have a longer lens, say a telephoto zoom like a 70-200, which is a very common focal length for a zoom lens, this would work, but you'd need a different diopter. You'd need one that was larger, of course, because this is a much larger lens, and it's also not as powerful. It's only 3 diopters, but it will give you plenty of magnification. One of the things that I don't like about using these close-up filters is, first of all, they are not usually the best quality. These Nisi ones are unusually good. There are some out there that are unreasonably bad, and you need to pick a good one. Nikon makes a couple of really nice ones. There are a couple of Japanese companies that make them as well, but Nisi has been my favorite, and I've used these a lot since I got them. They're very good. You can use them up to about 300 millimeters of length if you have that kind of lens. But honestly, you don't want to be carrying something like this around all day. This is big for a macro lens. Close-up filters or diopters are an option. Probably not the best. The quality of the images is probably going to be a little bit less than ideal. These things are relatively inexpensive, $100 or so for a good quality one. There is a problem with these. While they do preserve your light and they do preserve autofocus, what they don't do is give you infinity focus, because you've messed with the way the lens works. You can't long focus. You actually just have a band of focus that you can work within. And that, if you've never done it before, takes quite a bit of work to get used to it. It's even more so with the longer lens and the bigger diopter. Even though this is less powerful, this is a +3 diopter lens, this is a +5. When you're using it on a longer lens, you're getting more magnification. This thing will get you 1-to-1 at 200 millimeters. 1-to-1 is, that's macro world, so that's pretty good close-up. The problem is with this lens, you're only actually going to be able to focus between here and here. You cannot focus beyond that. It's all fuzzy. You cannot focus short of that. It's all fuzzy. That is not the way it is with a macro lens, which is why macro lens is my first choice. But let's get to that in due course. Whatever lens, whatever camera you buy, it probably came with a lens. And there is always a temptation to use the lens that came with your camera. Here's a kit lens. Well, that was a kit lens too, but this one's a kit lens off a slightly more expensive camera. It's actually not a bad lens. This is an 18-140 millimeters, a strange set of lengths. But yeah, there are 2 things that you could do with this lens to make it into a macro lens. 3 things. We'll talk about 2 of them, because the 3rd one you definitely don't want to mess with, and that's reversing the lens. Taking a lens and reversing it on your camera will turn it into a macro lens. You've probably heard about reversing lenses and extension tubes used in the same discussion. Reversing a lens just means turning it around backwards and placing it on the camera backwards. And it is actually a very good way to make a macro lens. The problem is you lose control of the lens unless it's an older lens that has a manual aperture ring. You can't connect with the camera and the lens together because it's backwards. So if you can't change the aperture, you're stuck with whatever your camera has, but which in a Nikon world is an open aperture, and in the Canon world it's a closed one. But either way, it's not going to work. So reversing a lens, in my opinion, is a cool trick to have. And there are many times I use a reversed lens in my photography. But I wouldn't want to be starting out trying to do it. As it happens, I did start out doing that and very quickly realized there had to be a better way, and I bought a macro lens. But if you're going to reverse a lens, you wouldn't do it with a zoom lens, and I guess that's the point I want to make. Your kit lens is a zoom lens. They're all broad zooms, usually from wide angle up to short telephoto, and they don't work in reverse. If you put it reversed on your camera, it will form a picture, and the picture will suggest that it's enlarged, but it won't be any quality, and it'll be full of aberrations and all kinds of oddities. So that's not going to work. I talked about extension tubes briefly. Here is a set of extension tubes. This is the kind that communicates between the camera and the lens so that you can control the lens's functions, like autofocus and the aperture, like so, and then that goes on your camera. It puts a big heavy weight kind of far out, and if you have cheap extension tubes like these, I worry about the thing sagging. But this will significantly increase the magnification ratio of this lens. Not as much as reversing it, but again, when you're using extension tubes, you're going to get light loss. You're going to get much less light than you're getting with the lens on the camera. Second, you won't be able to focus to infinity. And third, you might not think about this, but when the lens is moved out in front of the camera like this, the hole that you're shooting through, the aperture in the lens to the sensor, looks a lot smaller than it is. If you don't believe me, take something, anything, and put it on the wall, and then walk half a mile away and see if the thing's as big as it was when you put it on there. It'll be smaller. Same deal here. The aperture gets smaller as you add extension tubes. The smaller your aperture, the more the aperture interferes with the passage of light, and the more it causes a problem called diffraction. Diffraction softens pictures and ruins them. So this is dangerous, and you'll end up having to keep your aperture open, maybe not wide open, but pretty open, both to get enough light, but also to prevent diffraction softening. In other words, it becomes difficult to use. And when you're starting out in macro, you want to be able to, with a reasonable amount of comfort, point your camera, point your lens at a subject and know that you're probably going to get a picture. You'd like to be able to maybe shoot in aperture priority or in shutter priority so that you can not have to worry about all three things in your exposure triangle at the same time. You can do all of that with a macro lens. You can't do any of it with extension tubes or a reversed lens. So we're going to put those two modalities completely out the window. If you take my course, I will show you how to use both of those modalities and both of them together, and both of them combined with a whole bunch of different kinds of lenses to get staggeringly sharp pictures. As an aside, my favorite lens, I think, in the whole world of all of the lenses is this tiny little thing. The lens is only, of course, this piece. This is an enlarger lens. This is what you use to actually, like this, is what you use on an enlarger stand making enlargements of photographs. In the photographic world, that's what these do. But in the macro world, if you turn them around backwards and keep the aperture pretty wide open like that, these become breathtakingly sharp macro lenses. And boy, I just happened to luck out. I bought this one as a replacement, and it's got a big scratch in the front element. Seriously, a big deep scratch. You can probably see it. And this is still the sharpest lens I own. Now that tells you something about the lenses that I own, but also that this is very sharp. Inexpensive. This is a $50 lens. And I'm going to be showing you some lenses that cost a whole heck of a lot more than that. But that's not a good walking around lens. I've used it outdoors, but I explained that extension is difficult to use on the run. Well, it is, and you have a very limited depth of field. So you really have to be focus stacking when you're using a setup like this, and you aren't anywhere near that. As a beginner, we're not even talking about focus stacking. We're talking about one-shot macro photography where you see a subject, line them up, and take the picture. That's all you're concerned about. You're probably going to want to focus stack, and we will talk about it for several of our sessions. We're going to talk about focus stacking, and in the course, half the course is about it. But for right now, you just need to get started. And something that requires you to focus stack needs to be off your list. So my second favorite lens in the whole world is also off the list, because you're not going to use a microscope objective, not as a newbie in this field. You'll just get frustrated and quit. So we've talked about all of the fancy ways that you can make a macro lens out of a regular lens. We use prime lenses like a 35, 50 millimeter lens in reverse to make a nice macro lens. Great way to do it. Great fun way to use a lens. This is probably the cheapest lens made. $30 or something for this little 35 millimeter mirrorless lens. I flipped this around backwards and put it on the bellows with this setup, and it actually took great pictures. So yeah, it is a real option. A great way to have fun with a camera is to use your lenses in reverse. It becomes infinitely more complicated when the lens that you're using is one of the modern lenses that doesn't have an aperture ring on it. It has an internal aperture controlled by the camera. Not when it's reversed, it doesn't. So that becomes problematic. So unless you're planning on giving a diopter a try, you're probably going to want to get a lens that is made for macro photography. And I would wholeheartedly concur that that is a good idea. Getting a macro lens is a good idea if you want to get into macro the right way. In other words, if you want to do it in a way that's going to give you nice, sharp, bright pictures, if you want to do it in a way that you can take advantage of all of the functionality of your camera and whatever the lens offers, these are all built in for you in a macro lens. A macro lens does everything for you. You don't have to flip it around and put it on extension tubes and calculate distances and all that. That's something you can do later. You can experiment with that, and it's great fun, and you'll probably get hooked into doing it. But at first, you want something that makes it as easy as possible to get fantastic pictures, right? Right. So let's talk about macro lenses, because they're not all the same. Macro lenses, a lot of them these days that you get with Micro Four Thirds, for example, a lot of those macro lenses are actually 1-2 lenses, meaning that the image on your sensor is half the size of the image in real life. This is an important, very important concept to understand. When I say that a lens is 1-to-1, I am saying that the lens will reproduce whatever it is I'm looking at the same size on the sensor of the camera, not on your picture. So if you're thinking 1-to-1 means that the butterfly you're looking at in real life will be the same size on the screen of your camera, no. Or on an 8x10 print, no. It'll be the same size on the sensor. 1-to-1 might not sound like a whole lot of magnification to you. You might think, well, that's not even magnification. It's just normal size. Yeah, it is on the sensor. So if you take a picture of a small beetle with a 1-to-1 macro lens, say your beetle's 1/2 inch long, it's only barely going to fit on there. So you take the picture, click of the beetle, and it fills your sensor. When you make your print, that beetle is going to be monster big. So what people don't realize is that 5 times or 10 times or 20 times magnification, you better be photographing something really, really small, or you're going to run out of sensor to show it on. So 1-to-1 is plenty, is what I'm trying to say. And if you have a micro four thirds camera, 1-to-2 is also plenty. That is way well inside the macro range. Now, you're also going to see lenses that are 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 4.5-to-1 or 5-to-1. These are not beginner macro lenses. I will say that, and I will stand by my guns. A macro lens of the type that I'm going to recommend will allow you to focus at infinity. So you can use the lens as a 90 or 105 millimeter portrait lens if you want, or a landscape lens, or a macro lens. Instead of having a 7-foot minimum focusing distance, a regular macro lens, like the one I'm going to show you, will focus down to about 11 inches, like so, which means you can get close to your subject and fill the sensor with the image. These, which are going to magnify the image, this particular one is a layover that when it's fully extended will magnify the image 5 times, is incredibly difficult to use for a seasoned macro photographer. You don't realize until you start using something like this that you have to hold this very, very still, and you have a fraction of a millimeter of depth of focus, depth of field. So not much of your subject's going to be in focus unless you learn how to focus stack by hand, which is an advanced skill. This is going to be a very frustrating way to learn macro photography. I would say it's the most common mistake that people make, is thinking the magnification's the most important part. It's not the most important part. The most important part is getting a clean, crisp picture. If you do that, you can enlarge the thing until it looks like you are using a 5x lens, and you can get away with it because the resolution is so good because you use a good macro lens, which is what I'm going to suggest. If you're using one of these, you're always going to be struggling for quality. Now, the people who use these things every day get great results from them, no doubt. And I was surprised by how good my results were with it. But I would not have wanted to start out with this. It would have been endlessly frustrating. And if that was bad, this is even worse. This is the same magnification, but the working distance on this little bad boy is about 1 inch, 2 inches. It's hollow on the inside. All it is a mini lens that's separated from the camera. And yeah, this is impossibly hard to use by hand. I've used it on the focus rail and focus stacked with it, and it's okay. It's not terrible, but this is not what you want as your first macro lens. So the fact that it only costs $200, that's $200 you don't want to spend. This is the macro lens you get when you've already got every other macro lens you want, and you want one that's funny shaped, then you can get this one, but not now. big mistake. This company, Laowa, makes lenses that are called super macro, that are 2-to-1. They are a lot more similar. They are a lot similar. No, I was right the first time. They're a lot more similar to a regular macro lens, particularly the one I used, the 100mm f2.8. Very nice. That's a 2x lens. It might be an f2, an apochromatic lens at that. Very nice, very good pictures. And a nice, big, hefty, chunky lens. I like it. They make them for DSLRs as well as mirrorless. That, I think, would be a good lens to use. But I'm still going to recommend that the lenses you should put at the top of your list are fully functional, meaning they have autofocus so that you can use things like focus shift shooting if you have Nikon. We'll talk about that in a second. But fully functional automatic macro lenses. Now, there is a whole breed of mirrorless lenses out there that you can buy, like this one by the Thinking Artisan, TTA. I love the screw-on lens cap. This is a funny little lens. It's made to go on a mirrorless camera. I use it on my Fuji, and this little thing actually takes very nice pictures. I thought. I took it out there. It's got a manual aperture ring. It only costs $100, $99 or something. And this, I think, would be an appropriate place to start. If you've got a camera but you don't have a budget for a lens that's going to cost $600, $900, $1,000, this might be where you want to start. $99, put it on your mirrorless camera, use the manual aperture ring to get your depth of field set where you want it, and then use the manual focus. You should be using manual focus in macro anyway, because you just can't use autofocus. Autofocus isn't accurate enough to focus on the depth of field you'll have. You need to use your eye to get it in sharp focus to take the picture. If you rely on autofocus, you'll miss most of your shots. So this doesn't seem to have many functions. Well, because it doesn't have many functions, but it has the one you want. It takes pretty nice clear pictures for next to nothing. So this would be acceptable, but it would still be second choice over a fully functional macro lens. Now, by that I mean a traditional macro lens, either for a mirrorless camera or for a DSLR. And that is a lens like this, that is either a newer lens that has autofocus, vibration control, or what do they call it? Yeah, VC. This lens. I like the Tamron. The Tamron 90mm f2.8 is an internally focusing lens, meaning the parts that move are all internal, so you're not sucking dust into the thing all the time. It's got a nice wide 2.8 aperture. It's got fantastic vibration control that allows you to shoot at slow shutter speeds without introducing shake. That's why you need the VC. It buys you light. It also stops the blurry pictures just from the moving of the animal. But this is a lovely lens. And the reason I would show you this one is it costs half what the 105, which for most camera companies is their flagship macro lens, is about 100 millimeters. Why would you get 100 or 150 or 200 millimeters in a macro lens? One reason only. I told you this has a minimum focus distance of 11 inches. That means you have to get to 11 inches if you want to get the full 1-to-1. When you use a 200 millimeter lens, you can get this far away and still get 1-to-1. That's why it allows you to get closer to your subjects to get the full magnification without creeping the bugs out. Okay? And The best macro lens ever made, in my humble opinion, is the Nikon. It's actually the Micro Nikkor is the name of it. 200 millimeter f4 IFED. I think that's all the letters. It's an old lens. They don't make it anymore. It's ugly and it weighs a ton, and it is so sharp. There is a reason that you might want to think about keeping your focal length a little bit shorter, and that is if you prefer to photograph, say, things that don't run away very fast or run away at all, like plants, then you might not need that extra reach. And that extra reach comes at a cost. They're expensive. That 200 millimeter Nikon lens that isn't even made anymore costs $1,500 most places, if you can find one. $1,500 for a lens that is probably 20 years old when you buy it, but they're that beautiful. If you ever want to use it in the house for still life, or if when you start doing focus stacking, you want to use the macro lens for that, you don't want to be using a 200 millimeter lens because you'll have to have a big setup to reach the subject with the lens. So something on the order of 50 to 100 millimeters is a better macro lens for that. So the shorter focal length ones that you'll see lots of 50 millimeter entry-level macro lenses, they are not the sweet spot. They're great for indoors. They're great for focus stacking. They're not so great for outdoors, because when you only have 6 inches between you and the subject, you're going to have a hard time photographing anything that's even remotely skittish. So I would say your ideal range is 90 to 105 millimeters. This is a full frame lens, by the way, and it's important to think about that when you're buying the lens. Get it for the right camera system. They're tuned to work with the camera size they're made for. You're better off buying a D lens if you are shooting on a DX camera. In other words, I could shoot with the Tamron. It's a full frame lens on a crop frame camera, but it's kind of an expensive way to go. The D lenses are usually a lot cheaper, and the DX lenses is what I should be saying. But Nikon makes an 85 millimeter DX lens that is actually a little bit sharper than the Tamron. This is a true macro lens, a 1-to-1 autofocus lens. It does have vibration control. It's very nice. 85 millimeters. I've used this quite a lot. Not on this camera. We talked about cameras last time, and I told you not to get the entry-level one that doesn't have any buttons. This is why. This one doesn't have any buttons, and it's a pain to use. Get the 1 up from that, or 2 up from that. So this lens, and every lens maker makes one for their crop sensor cameras. They make a macro lens that's a little bit shorter, but will do a fantastic job of filling the sensor on this camera. This is still not a cheap lens. This I bought used 10 years ago, and it cost $600 used. They still cost that today. Macro lenses are a good investment if you keep them pretty. The big Nikon, the 105, costs $1,000. The Canon 100, the Canon 100 millimeters costs like $1,300. The Tamron here costs $600 or $700. I've got a sheet I put together with all the lenses that I recommend, the layers, everything that I've used that I think is worth owning. I've listed and explained why. So refer to that. What else? Laowa. That's going to come up again. Most of Laowa's lenses are manual focus, but they do have autofocus lenses, and the 2-to-1 is fine. It's harder to use than the 1-to-1, and I think it's better to learn on a 1-to-1. You'll find very quickly that 1-to-1 is plenty of magnification. Magnification is not the thing. You want a sharp lens. What am I forgetting? If you have a camera that I haven't mentioned and you want to know what the best macro lens for it is, let me know. Sony, it's the OSS-G 90 millimeters, and Fuji makes a lovely 100 millimeter lens. Everybody makes them and they're all good. Macro lenses are, generally speaking, built to more exacting standards than a lot of other lenses companies make because they have to be. The way the lens is arranged to allow this very short focus has a lot of precision lens making involved. So they are expensive. They're all expensive from any brand, but you can buy them used too. Unfortunately, the really good lenses, the ones that you want, the Canon Ls and the Micro Nikkors, don't really go down in price just because somebody's had it for 10 years. It's about the same price. So think about that. But bottom line, unless you are just trying to get your feet wet with a magnifying glass type thing, get something that's going to make you want to keep doing macro photography. Get a macro lens. You don't have to spend an absolute fortune on it, but if you want the best chance of taking the best pictures every time, get an automated, fully functional, modern vibration control macro lens for your camera system. You will be so glad you did. It'll pay for itself over and over again. No, it won't. You don't get paid for using it. It won't pay for itself at all, but it'll still be worth buying. So that's the bottom line. Buy a macro lens if you want to do macro photography. It's all in the name. Macro lens. They are made for macro. Everything else is something we cobble together. So buy a proper macro lens, and if you can get one with autofocus, even though you don't need it, why do you get it with autofocus if you don't need it? Well, you might want to use it as a not macro lens. It's another reason to get one of these, because I can take a picture of the mountains with this and then shoot the butterfly. Not with any of these other arrangements. You can't do that. So why else would you need a macro lens? I'll tell you what, you want to know more about macro lenses? Watch the course. If you want to know how to use all these other lenses, and if you want to know specifically why you need to buy which macro lens, check out my course. It'll be out in a few weeks. When you see it, you'll know what lens you need. But this is the way to go. I wish I could tell you there was a better alternative, but they already thought of the best alternative, and it's a macro lens. Up next is video number 4, and in video number 4, I am going to introduce you to all of the cool and different ways you can do macro photography. So thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Take care. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, and for those of you that do support my work through Patreon, there is a special treat waiting for you over on the Patreon website. There is a 2-page table of every macro lens that I recommend that you can buy today. And there are about 40 of them. They cover every camera brand and most of the third-party lens makers. So check that out. And don't forget, also over on Patreon, we have the live stream Q&A that is going to answer all the questions that have come up from this particular video. And that'll be in just about a week's time. So thank you again to my Patreon supporters. I really do appreciate your help. And if you would like to chip in about $10 a month towards my salary, then you are more than welcome to do so. And all of these extra benefits will be available to you as well.